Welcome to the first episode of the Self-Wired podcast. Self-Wired is a platform for self-education in the realm of psychology, philosophy, and personal growth. I'm Landon Daniel, and with me is my co-host Noah Fritz. In our first episode, we'll be discussing the double-edged sword of psychopharmacology, the implications of stress on mental and physical health, and the controversy of diagnostic criteria in psychiatry and the power the individual has over their own health.
Yeah, man, I'm really looking forward to doing this. This is a great tool for like you said, self-education, and I feel like as we go along in this, we'll really develop our own sense of knowledge and our own knowledge in this field, and it's always a work in progress. Nothing's ever truly complete, so I think it's good to stay in that mindset of continually. The only thing constant is change, essentially. So, yeah, man, this will be good, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think this will help a lot of people out, and I think it's a good way to introduce like the paradigm shift we're seeing today in modern health and in specifically in psychology.
Yeah, man, exactly. I think I've already learned a ton from your understanding of the human body and how to live a healthier life. I think what we're touching on is really there's a lot of controversy in terms of mental health. It's something that not a lot of people want to discuss in its depth, but I think if we can bring some of these subjects to the surface and just understand where the field of psychology is, because it is such a early field of research, and understand what we can do as individuals to learn about and become informed on becoming the healthiest version of ourselves.
Yeah, man. I think when we talked about the paradigm shift, I think what we're seeing and what you mentioned, because you mentioned this being about mental health, and that is true. But I think the big paradigm shift that we're seeing is a trend towards more holistic protocols, specifically seeing the human as as one functioning integrated organism. And so that means we're starting to coalesce all these different fields of medicine into a better understanding of how the human functions in its entirety. And I think that's like really cool because we're shifting away from the necessity to break everything down into systems, and we're kind of, now that we have broken everything down and we see the complexity of everything, we also see that complex interplay between all these different systems, whether it's endocrinology, rheumatology, looking at the body. We're looking at like gastroenterology, neurology, and then that goes into psychology and how all of these things are affected by one another. And it's a really cool time to see this. It's a really cool time to be learning about this stuff. There's a lot of cool data coming out now, and so we'll get more into that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, psychology's young, but I think there's a lot to be said about how quickly we're progressing, and how much we're learning, and not to mention the access to information that we have now. I know, obviously, that's a huge aspect of this podcast, is figuring out how to research appropriately.
Yeah,
how to dismantle the amount of information that we have access to and turn it into something worthwhile.
Yeah, man. Podcasts are the new medium of information in today's world. Like, it isn't just something you access through. You don't even necessarily have to be in university to get this knowledge anymore. You have access to the databases. You have access to information available throughout the internet, and with discussions. You can listen to academic lectures on YouTube and through podcasts, and it's really a great time for self-education and to really develop the power of self-education and developing your individual skills, your tools to learn yourself. to become a learner yourself, because that is, I mean, that's the goal of, university or any educational system in general, is to make people better students and better teachers of themselves, so they can correct their own mistakes as they go on, and they can learn to build on top of themselves as they go on.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the words of David Eagleman, you become the information that you digest. I think that's what we're doing, is we're, digesting as much information as we can, and we're attempting to organize that information into something coherent and useful to not only us, but, the world of YouTube and all the great things that YouTube has done for self-education. So let's get into this. Pull up that PowerPoint and we will start our
Yeah,
discussion.
man. I think this is so. Again, we're talking about the power of this developing paradigm in health, in creating ourselves, so to speak, in creating our health, and like putting, should I say, more responsibility in our own hands, in terms of how we can become healthier. And here you'll see I have a picture of this guy Aubrey Marcus and Joe Dispenza. And if you know anything about Joe Dispenza, you know that he is essentially the core idea, the core thesis of his work is the power of placebo, essentially. The power that, based on your own self-talk, your internal state, you can regulate your physiological function, your genetic expressions. And it's kind of the blend, it's kind of showing, he's kind of the gateway of this, of the more, let's say, new agey manifestation talk with, emerging science, with and I can't speak too much upon the quantum aspects of this, but he is kind of the leader in this field, and the public, the kind of the talking head of this. And I had a quote from his podcast with Aubrey Marcus, and it says right there that hell is living in survival, and heaven in creation. And I thought that was a really cool quote, because here he's kind of made this into, he's kind of extrapolated this into like this idea of heaven and hell. And what's cool about that is, the earth is suspended between heaven and hell. That's how we think about it in story, and so, and we as humans inhabit that earth, so humans are suspended between heaven and hell. Well, parallel that with another concept. So in this case, hell would be associated with the body, because he says hell is living in survival. And what he means by that is you're living autonomically, you're living unconsciously. And when you're living unconsciously, you're living in terms of the way in which your body has evolved to adapt to its environment. So pretty much you're receiving external stimulus from your environment, and you're just reacting. You're simply reaction. You're reactive, I should say. Reactive to everything that goes on around you. And that's living in survival, living in essentially being unconscious of yourself. And then heaven we associate with the mind, with the spirit, with reason and intellect. And this is our more, I guess you could say, human characteristic. This is what separates us from the animal, so to speak, is our ability to regulate ourselves over our body, over our instincts. And this is where we see the emerging paradigm of using the power of the mind to govern the body. So using what we have internally, what we inherently possess, and using that to transform the body, using that to transform our condition.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, this, it coincides so well. Yes, it's a bit new age to think that consciousness has implications on your reality. But I mean, if you look at the data from CBT, it's so, your internal dialogue is so incredibly important to the regulation of your hormones and your stress response. Your consciousness does in fact correlate with your health, and your health, spills over into multiple different facets of your everyday life. So yeah, I think that's such a beautiful way to put this in a poetic way, you know, there is a certain amount of conquest that you need to have over your own survival mechanisms. And if you don't understand that, you know, you're living in survival.
Yeah, exactly. And if you know anything about Joe Dispenza's work, like we said, he's about creating the lives, the circumstances that we want, by first going in. And by going in, we regulate everything outside of us. And this goes into the idea that we'll talk about later, which is like how we manage stress, because a part of managing stress is how you perceive that stressor. And so if you can change your internal state, you can change the way in which you perceive the external stimulus, and that in turn eliminates the stress, so to speak. So yeah, so here we're talking about creating. You know, hell is living in survival, and heaven in creation. So in heaven, we're creating the circumstances. We are being our own using our own consciousness. We are governing our our instincts, and we're not our instincts necessarily, but we're governing the external world, so to speak, and manifesting the life that we want. And it's really cool because, now we're going into a concept that I think is really important for this as well, and that is this. If the way you should think about this, and the reason we're seeing so much disease prevalence in today's world, in the modern world, is that we have this very slow evolutionary process. You can see here, 4 to 2.5 million years ago is when we knew Australopithecus, which is, you know, a species of humans, of Homo sapiens, to have existed. They were the first, like they're one of the first bipedal creatures. We saw the first bipedal ancestors of humans, and again, 4 to 2.5 million years. So this is a very long process to get to where we've been today. And so think of that as more of like a slow linear growth. But then we come to today, and we got this guy here. Now this guy, why is he in this state? Well, the best way to think about this is there's a lot of mismatch between our current environment with the environment in which our biology is used to, because this guy comes from everyone else before him. And what are these mismatches? Well, I want you to think 50 to 60 years ago, you know, you had these telephones, rotary telephones, and within a matter of that time, we've created, you know, supercomputers and I don't know if you can see that. I don't know if I have to move over here or not. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if that was in the way or not, but yeah, now we have supercomputers in our pockets, and this a technology like that was in a smartphone, that's in a smartphone today, was a technology that had to fill up a room worth of hardware, full of computer hardware. You know, it was massive, and now we have that technology in our pocket, and that was only within a matter of 50 to 60 years. And then you can take the example of the environment that we live in, like the actual physical external environment that we live in. You know, 500, 600 years ago, we were living outdoors, you know, summer or winter, rain or shine. So we were living more in accord with the temperatures, with the seasons. Whereas now we have modern insulation, constant heating. We have 24/7 access to light, even though in the winter months, the light cycles are much shorter, and temperature dominates our circadian rhythms when it gets much colder. But we don't have that access to that now. So that part of our physiology is shunted away, so to speak. And, you know, on top of that, we've created transportation that, you know, keeps us warm as well, and it is created an ability to travel in a way that we've never seen before, to transport foods that we don't usually have. So now we have access to foods that wouldn't necessarily be available seasonally, and that creates another biological mismatch. You know, we also there's also the aspect that we don't expend as much energy hunting that food, so we're much more sedentary. We're becoming better at that with gyms and whatnot, you know, but generally speaking, our movement as a species has gone down a lot lower. And we also have the advent of large cities where everything's aggregated into one area, into one space. And so that just adds on to this phenomenon. And this has all occurred within such a short time span relative to the manner in which we have evolved. And so again, we have a mismatch between our environment and our biology.
Right.
And so for this, that only creates not a lot of physical pathology, but also a lot of psychological pathology. And I know we talked about that where, we have psychological pathology in that, for example, we have access to meeting so many more people than what we're evolutionarily used to, and our social groups have expanded so much. Well, they have the potential to expand, though we don't necessarily. We still abide by those evolutionary rules. They've shown that in studies where like we usually best aggregate in a group of like 150 people, and that's typically, we might follow thousands of people on Instagram, but we only really associate ourselves and compare ourselves with about 150 people, which is an example of this evolutionary principle of like our social dynamics, and the fact that our biology hasn't caught up with this exponential growth in technology. And here on this next slide, I have this is a graph that I know some graphs you included, and I know you wanted to riff on these a bit. So talk to us a bit about that.
Well, like you were getting at, our evolution is a slow process, but what we're seeing is the exponential growth of society and the way that intermingles with technology. So these are some graphs on homicide rates. To the left, you have the older versions of humanity, and these are huge numbers in terms of homicide. You were very likely to have up to 60% of your population wiped out through warfare or tribal disputes. And then at the bottom, you see the percentage of population that is impacted by homicide in states. So large state societies with functioning governments have a steep drop off in terms of homicide rates. And then the graph to the right, you have world homicide rates, and as you can see, it's a pretty intense decline, and that's the entire world just seeing a steep drop off in homicide. And like Noah was getting at, we have shelter, clean water, poverty is at an all-time low. Violence in the form of capital punishment, homicide, death from warfare, they're all declining. We have readily accessible technology as well as entertainment. We can be in contact with anyone no matter where they are in the world. And well, all these things are really great. We're not necessarily caught up to that in terms of our physiology. What we're going to get to later is the role that our sympathetic nervous system plays in terms of stress. We're still working with software that is predisposing us to look for threats in the form of other people or predators. And our brain can't compute the fact that we're no longer in danger. We have shelter. We don't have to worry about where our next meal comes from. There's a certain percentage of the population that does, yeah, but the vast majority of us are fine. Yet we're still having a response as if we have to fend for our lives every instant.
Right. And so I think it's more appropriate to say that the stressors are still there, and like the threats are still there, or more they've transformed into like more psychological stressors. But they are perceived in the same way biologically.
Right. Yeah. They're life threatening when in fact they're trivial compared to what our ancestors had to contend with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where we'll get into this a lot of like forms of therapy, such as, CBT, and this general awakening or what should I say, this upgrading in consciousness, so to speak, this elevation, this raising in consciousness that will help to mitigate stress and to improve the health of one's total organism. physical and psychological, because like we said before, this is the human is it functions as one entire system, and that doesn't just include the body, but like our thoughts and the more kind of ethereal aspects of us, so to speak. The spiritual aspects, they're not disconnected. It's a separate entity from us, so to speak, but it's also the same. So it's kind of paradoxical in that sense. And I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, it's all belongs to the same organism, and so we see this transformation, I guess, this psychologization. We're psychologizing, I guess, our threats, and that requires, now that it's in the domain of psychology, we have to develop our understanding of these things in a psychological sense, and that's what we're doing in today's world. We're taking things away from kind of understanding things externally or perceiving threats and reacting to stimuli from outside of ourselves, and we're now beginning to learn to create from the inside out. Again, back to Joe Dispenza, living in hell, or hell is living in survival, and heaven in creation. So we're learning to create from our own internal state.
Right. And it's a huge question whether or not we can do that. I know both of us are on the side of there are steps you can take to regulate yourself intrinsically. But what we'll see as we get through these slides is that the common paradigm is that you definitely need extrinsic things in the form of medication to alleviate the symptoms of a maladaptation in terms of in terms of society with your physiology. So it's a heavy hitting question, and it's something that I don't think either of us claim to be experts on, but because we grow up in the society, and because we understand our own psychology, we can understand the implications of, like you said, kind of upgrading ourselves to fit to society, because it's moving quick and we have to adapt.
Right, and that gets in that deeper question of, should we try to adapt to the society based on what it is we're trying to move towards? What is the type of society we're trying to build? And that, again, enacts the question of where are we? What is our vision? We have to become more conscious of ourselves and what we are doing in terms of building a society and building a medical construct. And like, how are we going to, how do we conceptualize what mental illness is, what illness is, in terms of what it is we're trying to build towards? What do we need to heal, and what do we need to optimize towards, so to speak? What is it we're trying to optimize? It depends on, like, in the terms of, like, if you're trying to achieve a certain goal physically, are you wanting to burn fat? Are you wanting to lose a certain amount of weight? Are you wanting to build muscle, build strength? Are you wanting to improve your cognitive function? Are you wanting to, be able to get ready to perform an athletic feat, like a marathon or something? Like, what is it that you're moving towards? And then we have a better idea of how we're going to go about this. So does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a question of whether are we going to scrap everything that Mother Nature attempted to build for however million years that our organism has been, working towards creating in the name of scientific and societal progression? Or are we looking to return to the way that our body is created to work?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a good thing to shift to this idea of this, red pill, blue pill dichotomy, so to speak. Because in the modern world, when we talked about the mismatches and all the comforts we're afforded, and you can see we've become much more docile compared to past civilizations, and that probably stems largely from this comfort that we receive from modern technology. And you could say that's the blue pill, so to speak. That's you taking the blue pill, so to speak. Whereas taking the red pill would be reverting back to ancestral health principles, awakening to how we've developed as humans. You know, whether that be the way that we ate, whether that be how we slept, how we lived according to our environment, the way in which we constructed a social group, how we constructed the tribes that we lived in, you know, how we lived in tribes and how that shapes us today. And sort of, you could say that the red pill is kind of going back to reclaim health, whereas the blue pill is kind of being stuck in the comfort of today's world and not awakening, so to speak. But that isn't the full story, because you can never really take just the blue pill or take just the red pill. Um, you know, it's more, think of it less of black and white in this case, of like it's entirely one thing and it's entirely not. It's more of ratios, percentages of how much we are to go forward with our technology, and take what we have, while also reverting and keeping what we have from our past, what we have from our evolution. Um, and so, what we offer you here, we offer the purple pill, and I like this concept. I really like this. Um, so yeah, anything else you want to add to that, Landon?
Well, I think there's a way in which we can definitely have the best of both worlds. I think nature is a wonderful thing. Nature is a hell of a lot smarter than an individual person will ever be. So learning to coincide with nature as opposed to leaving it behind in the shadows. You know, it doesn't make sense to scrap everything that we were made to in the name of some unspecified direction that we're all supposed to be moving towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, it's like in the Matrix, where the blue pill, and in this case, we would say it's going forward without acknowledging your past. That is essentially living in an illusion, because to not accept and integrate what you are, you know, that is an illusion. You're not living in the truth, and so you have to take what we've from what environment we've evolved, and integrate that into today's world, so that way we can go forward with the technology we've created, and we can optimize in that sense. You know, taking the technology of today and blending that with our understanding of ancient and evolutionary principles of health and how the organism has developed. Because when you get more aligned with how an organism has developed from the past, you're going to become, generally speaking, a healthier individual. Because evolution is a conservative process, because it holds on to what it has, because there's so much potential in for damage and for self-destruction or destruction from the external environment. And so there's very minuscule possibilities that transforming or evolving, and changing is going to allow us to survive. But that isn't to say that everything new won't do that. So we have to kind of intermingle and get in those details, where the devil is in the details, and bring out a new, so, you know, upgraded, so to speak, upgraded human.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing to point out is that nature holds on to what it has because it works really well. You know, that's the thing that kept people alive the best. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's fairly egotistical to think that, um, like you said, we can discard a holistic view in the name of working on one subcategory of a human being. We need to take into account so many different aspects and so many different details if we're going to cultivate a society that isn't prone to self-destruction.
Yeah, no, I like that. And we kind of ragged on, you know, with the blue pill. It's like almost like we're ragging on modern society entirely, like it has nothing, beneficial to offer, and that's not true. Well, not even that necessarily, but we're as if there's no complexity or no difficulty in modern society, and that simply isn't the case, because with the advent of newer technology, of these growth of societies, of these we face new challenges, and so we face greater we have a more connectivity with people across the globe, and we have this chance to become more collectivized and to become more unified. But going back to our evolution, that isn't how we've evolved. We haven't evolved. We've only evolved within a subset of about 150 people or so. And so that's another mismatch, a psychological or social mismatch, if you will. We have that, and the aspect of, like, you've used this term, if it bleeds, it leads. So we get a lot of news of so many hardships across the globe that previously we would never have been exposed to.
Right. Well, and it's not even a large part of it is like our ancestors never had to worry about a hurricane going on the other side of the globe.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't compute the amount of tragedy if we're going to take in the entire globe. We're just not cut out to do it. But the other aspect of this is, like you said, if it bleeds, it leads. There's been a lot of talk about, like fake news going on in politics right now. The real fake news is that the world is like, we have this conception of the world that it's increasingly terrifying and there's so many things going on, when in reality a lot of violence is going down. There's been huge leaps and bounds in terms of medical technology. Homicide, like we talked about earlier, is at an all-time low. We're working towards eliminating poverty, but what the news does is it works on our negativity bias in order to get views. So it puts out the worst stories to get the most amount of views, because they know that that's what people will tune into. That's what the deeper parts of our brains want to see, because like in nature, if you're not looking for threats, the threats are going to kill you. So it's not necessarily a accurate representation of the world.
Right. It's much more. The news is much more emotionally. It wants to be emotionally reactive because, like you said, those emotional headlines tap into, like, the deeper parts of the brain, the more primal, instinctual parts of the brain, and that's the more instantiated part of the brain, and that typically presides over our higher abstract thinking capabilities. So, we like to think as modern humans that we're these totally rational and we're totally dominant over our instincts. But this is one of these things that we're coming back to understand now, with an understanding of evolution, of a growing trend towards holistic health, is that we're just as equally, if not more, governed by our instincts and by our lower brain than we are by our what we know consciously.
Right.
And so what we have to do is grow that higher part of our brain to understand that we are a part of we are animals, and that we are governed by instinct, so to speak, but blending essentially instinct with reason, so that way we can take the best of our emotions, because our emotions gives us life and charge. It charges us to act, and blending that with a reason to act in a certain way, and when or not we should transform or channel those instincts into something else, or we should express those instincts and act on them.
Right. Yeah.
But anyways, we talked about this because this is the potential that's in the growing complexity. Though it's a mismatch with our biology, we have to continually grow, and we're growing to we're continually in evolution, and so this complexity has potential. However, this mismatch leads to a lot of what we mentioned before. It leads to a lot of stress. Because we're not meant to handle this. And again, this is not a physical stressor, so to speak. It's not like we're constantly being threatened with environmental exposure, like to the cold or something, or, to predation or to starvation, so to speak. But it is a stressor nonetheless in the way that we perceive it, in the way that it gets instantiated into our biology. And that's where I wanted to talk more about this, which is a diagram of something known as the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. You can read it there. What we're looking at is, you can see the hypothalamus, which is in it's a deeper part of the brain it begins here, and when it perceives a stress, and what it does is it comes down and releases CRH. You can see it on this diagram here, and this gets produced in cells in the anterior pituitary, which then produces ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which travels into the blood and then to your adrenal glands, which to the top on your kidneys. And this secretes what we know as cortisol, which is the stress hormone. That's like the main thing that we know about stress, is we hear about cortisol. If you have high cortisol, that's not good. We know that chronic stress is not good for a lot of things. So, like, to name a few, some repercussions of chronic stress, we get heart disease, obesity, depression. You can read them there. And also what I highlighted is systemic inflammation, because the stress response, though it suppresses inflammation initially, when you're chronically trying to protect yourself from the external environment, which is why it suppresses your immune system, is because it's not focused on repair and healing. You're not focused on the inner work when you're constantly focused on things outside of yourself. And that suppresses and impairs your immune system. And what that will do over time is lead to an inability to manage inflammation, which leads to inflammation. And we know inflammation is a problem for a lot of things, such as depression, and anxiety. And you can see a correlation between inflammation and psychological disease, not only physical, but psychological pathologies. So here I have a quote from another study. At least 50% of depressed adults show this HPA axis is dysregulated. And that's pretty substantial when you think about it. Here I have another diagram that just pretty much shows stress and depression. Downstream, it leads to inhibited neuroplasticity and cellular resilience. So pretty much your brain can't grow and it can't expand, so to speak. You're inhibiting that ability to expand when you are chronically stressed. We look back at this slide, we see an atrophy of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Now, why would chronic stress cause an atrophy of the prefrontal cortex? Well, think about the prefrontal cortex. It's like, if you think about the prefrontal cortex, it's the top of your brain. You get your brain stem and your limbic system down in the lower parts, your cerebellum. And what the brain has done over time, it seems, is like it's grown parts on top of it over time. And so the prefrontal cortex is what we associate with abstract thinking, our more complex capabilities. Even though AI can mimic the more abstract or complex abilities than it can the simple tasks of moving, or what we think is simple, moving. So we can't replicate that in AI as well as we can our thinking. But anyways, when you're chronically stressed, you're taking yourself away from thinking or worrying about abstract thoughts, or worrying about these higher aspects of ourselves, because you're trying to moderate yourself and protect yourself from the external environment. So you literally lower yourself from the top of your brain into your more instinctual primal brain, because like I said, you're trying to protect yourself from the external environment, and you become more of an animal in the sense. You become more unconscious. So it's very interesting how that plays out, because that goes back to, you're living in survival at that point when you're chronically stressed. You're not living in creation. You're not living in you're not creating your own reality. You're not moderating your stress response because you're not aware of the stressors, or you're not perceiving them in a way that you could.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to look. Like obviously, everything you said is, spot on. We build on top of older software, and an aspect of that is neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to adapt to its current environment. So it's incredibly paradoxical that the thing that is the problems of the past, which are these more fearful based response, it's the very thing that's keeping you from adapting to a more complicated environment later on. um, like you were talking about, the aspect that would help you think through a solution, and the aspects that would allow you to move in accord with the current society are getting shut off due to these more primal aspects. Um, it's fascinating, really, that the stress response is limiting your brain's ability to um, physically shift in order to help you out.
Right. And yeah, it was really interesting that you put it like that. When you're right, neuroplasticity is required because that that plastic capability of our brains is what makes us so unique as humans, is that we are so adaptive to the environment in which we live. However, when you're chronically stressed due to mismatches, you actually inhibit your ability to better evolve to the environment that you're currently inhabiting. So that's so you could say that by going back and reclaiming your health, so to speak, and becoming more conscious of these things, by reclaiming those things, you become better for today and better for the future. You know, it's very interesting. So you can only go forward as much as you were able to go back.
Yeah,
Does that
yeah,
make sense?
yeah. You can't leave nature behind you. You have to take it with you, whether you like it or not. You have to learn how to manipulate the aspect of you that is an animal fighting for its life in order to become this new version of a human being that needs to think abstractly and extrapolate on information and adapt incredibly quickly to changing environments, and environments that are changing quicker and quicker as we go on. Um, you if you try to be just a prefrontal cortex, that those lower aspects of your brain that are so old, they're not going to budge. They're going to come with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and here I've included a short diagram. You see stress downstream leads to inhibit neuroplasticity, but it also shows that low serotonin and low norepinephrine, which are two chemicals in the brain or in the body that have been shown to be low in symptoms or in cases like that of depression. You can see when those are low, it inhibits something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a protein, a neurotrophic factor responsible for initiating synaptogenesis, neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons. And there's interplay between serotonin and BDNF, and you can see some quotes that I've included here, like in this rat embryo, exposure to BDNF, it doubled serotonin neurons and axon growth. And though it's in rats, it's important to remember that even this study even included this. The serotonin system, or 5-HT, 5-hydroxytryptamine, is evolutionarily the most ancient and expansive neurotransmitter system. And that's why you hear, Jordan Peterson, he's able to talk about lobsters and their relevance to human neurochemistry, because serotonin is such an ancient chemical in nervous systems across all animals. So
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
yeah, and it's important to reiterate that this norepinephrine is an aspect of the fight or flight response. So this is the physiology of how depression and anxiety are related to the individual stress response on a chemical level.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, and I don't have much more to say about this slide, but if we go forward, this goes on, and this is from another review discussing inflammation and its correlation to depression. So physical inflammation in the body correlates with, has been shown to be more heavily associated with depression and depressive symptoms. Here I have some quotes from it. So for example, after a myocardial infarction or a heart failure, so to speak, there's elevated TNFA, which is an inflammatory protein. It induces inflammation in the body, and that is associated with greater depression. And also, it talked about later in this review that psychotherapy resulted in decreases in inflammatory cytokine levels. So it's not even a physical intervention that you needed to reduce your inflammation, but it was a psychological intervention of discussing these things, of going through psychotherapy that alleviated inflammation. And that's just an interesting interplay.
A beautiful example of the way in which our consciousness has an effect on our physiology. A lot of people think the brain and the mind are different symptoms or different systems, but very real way in which shifting your consciousness and shifting your perceived reality and these things impact your physiology on a measurable level. Another great example of this, it's called give-up-itis or psychogenetic death. So what this is they first found it in Korean war camps, where Korean war camp prisoners literally lost their will to live. And so there's no real physiological thing that they can point to, like, okay, their heart failed, or this happened that resulted in death. It was literally their orientation to reality that killed them. And so it's these the impact of your brain on the rest of your body and on your health is, there's so many different examples of the way in which it's of the utmost importance to your physical health to have a healthy orientation and perception of reality.
Well, and you also hear about that in people who may have lost a loved one. They lost a loved one, and when they were elderly themselves, and they die. When that happens, they can will themselves to die, based upon their kind of giving up of life, so to speak. Yeah. So it was a internal psychological choice to cease their life.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds made up. Anyone who doesn't believe us, look up give-up-itis, and you can find multiple articles of, dying of a broken heart. It's essentially dying of broken consciousness. Your orientation towards life is the thing that has this ripple effect on the rest of your body. It can result in your death. It's amazing, really. Sad, but amazing.
Yeah. And, going on to look at inflammation and its correlation with depression. This one, if you look at the bottom, you can see that LPS, which is lipopolysaccharide, and lipopolysaccharide is a bacteria that is a gram-negative bacteria, but it's found heavily in the blood of those with sepsis, which is something people die of. Like you die of excess bacteria or of excess a toxin in the blood, and so LPS is a major player in that. So when you usually to induce inflammation, we'll use LPS, and that's what they did in this study. And they induced rats with LPS, and they treated these rats with SSRIs and SNRIs, which are two antidepressant drugs, and it actually improved markers of inflammation. So it decreased a pro-inflammatory cytokine, and it increased an anti-inflammatory cytokine. So that's just an explanation of the one mechanism as to how these pharmaceuticals can work. So it's a good way of understanding how you can achieve psychological health by physical means, by more lifestyle intervention. For example, proper diet and exercise are huge, and so I thought that was really interesting. And I also included this article at the bottom because it showed conflicting evidence, and I'm sorry if you can hear that chainsaw in the distance. Um, and it shows conflicting literature with serotonin, it being pro and anti-inflammatory in certain cases. And I can't remember if that necessarily has to do with the pathways or the receptors to which serotonin binds. So where specifically in the body it acts to make it more pro and anti-inflammatory. But it got me thinking as to like, what is the context in which you're using an SSRI or an SNRI? So it isn't even straightforward that the chemicals themselves are going to act in such a straightforward manner. So it really depends, like, as to how you're administering these, and like the context as to what your situation is and what your psychological state is as to whether or not it will induce inflammation or prevent inflammation. And it's not like inflammation is bad in itself. You know, it has a purpose in your body to induce healing. Like the immune system, when it's activated, it's inducing inflammation to heal and to recover. So it just goes on to show the importance and the prevalence of your perception towards health and towards how you heal. It isn't merely something outside of your hands. And that's a big part of what we're talking about, what Joe Dispenza talks about, what, the Stoics and, others have talked about, where it's a matter of moderating your internal state to heal yourself. So, and I don't know if you have anything to speak on that with regards to serotonin, in the it being conflicting as to whether or not, is it inflammatory, is it anti-inflammatory? It's not straightforward.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is understanding the role in which your like, I know you touched on this, but the role that your environment plays on the level of these chemicals that you have, or the level of chemicals that you don't have. We touched on earlier your place in the social hierarchy mitigates both testosterone and serotonin. So by moving up the hierarchy, you can increase your levels of serotonin. And in the example, like you mentioned before, of Jordan Peterson, by administering certain antidepressants and even lobsters, you can change their perceived location in the hierarchy, and they'll start moving around as if they are higher status. So, the implications of that on the individual are, if you can learn to do things like changing your environment to fit your needs, exercising and eating right, you can change the level of hormones that are um, at your disposal. And the implications of that on both physical and mental health are extreme. But it's not spoken about much. It's mostly, in a lot of cases, it's rely on external medication to change your outlook on life. And in some cases, that's a huge help to a lot of people. And it's, in a lot of cases, it's a necessity. But for the everyday individual that deals with the problems of life, other measures are more effective and healthier.
I was muted. Yeah, and it depends on how you. It's also like, how do we define, like, what do you consider medicine? Like when we think of medicine, this is I think a problem with a lot of modern medicine today is, when you think of medicine, you think of prescriptions, you think of pharmaceuticals, that these pills that work on specific mechanisms that have been developed after isolating certain pathways in certain hormones, when in reality those hormones and those pathways all work together in that integrated system that is the human. And that's what you think of medicine, whereas medicine is anything that heals. It's something that brings healing, and it's not just something delegated to pills and to even anything external. Medicine is a perception. It's like, it can be a way of thinking about of how do you heal, and it's a way of thinking about the things in your life, like the stressors in your life. Are they actually stressors? Are they worth stressing about? That's another that goes into, like, what's worth stressing about, and what your perception, how it moderates your stress response. And this is another graph that I showed where people with high depression and a high CRP, which is C-reactive protein, which is another great marker of inflammation in the body. So people with high CRP and high scores of depression are about six or am I reading this right? About 6 times is likely to be sensitive, or 6 times is sensitive to pain in rheumatoid arthritis as those with low CRP. So if you score a high depression but you have a low CRP, you're 6 times less likely to be sensitized to the pain of rheumatoid arthritis.
And what is CRP again?
C-reactive protein, and that's just all I can really speak about. That is one marker that we use to measure amounts of systemic inflammation in someone's body. So going on, and I know you wanted to riff a bit on this slide because this is really important too in terms of how society today is more and more reliant on medications and things external of themselves. They're more reliant on something to fix them, so to speak, as if they're broken and like they need something outside of themselves.
Right. So the important thing to reiterate with this is these are a lot of statistics that are showing an increase in psychopharmaceutical medication. And we're not anti-medication by any means. We understand that these medications work and they're an incredibly important thing and they're a huge milestone in psychology. But the problem with this is a lot of these mental health diagnoses are misdiagnosed. These aren't really representative of an accurate diagnosis, and a lot of that is problems with our tools for diagnosing. For a lot of other health problems, you can use technology to look and get an understanding of what's going on inside the body. But because psychology is such a young field, we don't necessarily have those technologies at our disposal. So a lot of these are subjective reports from the people getting these diagnoses. They're explaining to someone how they feel, and they're using a platform to attempt to rate their subjective experience on just with a paper and pen. So you see here ADHD diagnoses had a threefold increase. Direct-to-consumer promotion has grown in huge amounts in the last 7 years. Children are getting more and more prescriptions for stimulants. 11% of the population above the age of 11 now take antidepressants. And then at the bottom, you see a graph from the late 1990s, or I'm sorry, the late 1990s into 2010. And you can see just how much antidepressant use has grown. And so what we need to understand about these prescriptions is 79% of these medications are prescribed by primary caregivers. These people aren't going to see psychiatrists who are experts in a field and experts at diagnosing and understanding people. They are, like I said, just primary caregivers. Another statistic is only about 25 to 50% of patients with depressive disorders were accurately diagnosed. That's not to say that they didn't have depression, but the actual diagnosis of their specific depression was misdiagnosed. So the other important aspect of this is if there is a misdiagnosis and the person is diagnosed with a major depressive disorder and that depressive disorder is severe, they'll respond to medication. But people with a mild form of depression won't respond well to medication. Other means need to be taken.
And I think that speaks really well to the fact that a majority of people, the majority of people aren't, severely depressed. They're not diagnosed with severe cases of MDD, but this speaks more in the mild cases. That speaks more to a general population, to a more majority of society, and that antidepressants work as well as placebo, and that kind of highlights the power of placebo.
Yeah.
And that could, if you could try to extrapolate that and try and take that to the more extreme end, saying that someone who's practiced in self regulation of the autonomic nervous system, who's practiced, like someone like Wim Hof or Joe Dispenza, someone who is very a proponent of the power of the internal self-talk, of the internal state. If someone practiced that for long periods of time, they would be better able to regulate even in more severe cases. Though that is kind of contradictory in that, would you even get to a severe state like that, a severe chemical imbalance, if you're already practicing that?
Right.
And so,
Yeah,
but yeah, I think that's a great point.
it's interesting to touch on, like we use placebo as a way to measure how well a medication works, obviously. So when a lot of people hear that antidepressants worked just as well as placebo in mild forms of depression, they hear, oh, antidepressants don't work. But what they're really measuring is placebos work very well. And one thing to note in these studies, people were in a position where they were in contact with professional psychotherapists or clinicians who were actively attempting to help the individual heal. And they were saying, okay, even if this medication doesn't work, other medications down the line might, and you will be constantly monitored by people who are concerned about your health. And that's a testament to our ability as individuals to help each other heal and grow. It's incredibly important to have an orientation towards healing, and it's incredibly important to have to be in a position where people are caring about how you are doing, and to be paying close attention to your emotional state. That is, in a lot of cases, the best medicine towards having a better orientation and changing the kinds of hormones and the kinds of brain circuitry that are going on in your brain. And it's I mean, fascinating to note that this isn't a necessarily an extrinsic thing. It's an internal mitigation, and it's an orientation towards your own emotional state as opposed to an extrinsic pill.
Yeah, and I think that's honestly, a great tip, or a great exercise for anyone who wants to kind of begin to develop their own self-talk, and to begin to change themselves from the inside out and take control of their health. Where you take a simple reframing of a situation in which you feel like you are lacking in a certain quality, or you are debilitated in some way, you're sick in some way, or you're not as strong as you'd like to be in some area of your life. You reframe that as a process. Given we're in a continual process of growth, in a continual process of change in life, so don't take it as, oh, I'm lacking this, or I'm sick, or I'm weak. You say, no, I'm growing towards this, I'm moving towards this, I'm healing. That is one simple reframing and a change in perception that can alter your physiology.
Right. Yeah, and we saw that with the statistic regarding lowered inflammation in terms of psychotherapy. Having someone who can sit down with you and provide an opportunity for insight into your own experience has real consequences. And what we're seeing is a lot of people are obviously it's not their fault, but the idea is that we can solve these issues using antidepressants, and primary caregivers are kind of handing them out like candy. So if there was an understanding that a better approach would be therapy, and not only would it work better, but it would make you a better individual via insight into your experience and understanding your past and making plans for the future. What that can do for your mental health is astounding, and it's not going to come with attempting to put a band-aid over your negative feelings.
Yeah, it's all, I mean, it's so, this development of psychology, understanding how the subjective world influences our biology is such a fascinating growing field. And the and it's complex because we're in such a nascent field of research. Psychology itself is so young. It's a little over a century old. And so you can think before that, I mean, this was essentially the idea of how do we study, like how do we understand the mind and what it is in a scientific sense. Now, that isn't to say that cultures have understood, how they haven't understood psychological processes in spiritual means. Like the East, for example, has a different methodology of understanding things than Western science does. But in terms of the West, in terms of how we've developed psychology as a science, we have developed things like the DSM-5, which is typically esteemed as almost like a Bible for psychologists. It's how we diagnose mental illness. Now, there is some controversy over the DSM-5, which I thought was really interesting. I didn't realize that before we started getting into this, but the purpose of psychology and what it's done is it's brought structure to studying mental illness, to studying the mind in general. It's trying to be objective about the subject, and that is why it's such a difficult and subjective field. Here is another article talking about the fact that the DSM-5 has become more expansive and more inclusive of different types of disease. We create more diagnoses for different illnesses. We create more diagnoses. Essentially, we're diagnosing different, more intricate subsets of things.
Right. We become more inclusive in terms of what we understand as a mental disorder. One of the things that we both found out in researching the DSM-5 is that things like ADHD are confused with things like puberty. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the increase of stimulant use among young children, because maybe they're a young boy and they can't sit still, so automatically put them on a stimulant so they can sit down for 8 hours a day and do schoolwork, which is, like we were talking about earlier, it's totally contrary to the physiology of a young man, especially because that's where most of these diagnoses are geared towards. That young child is geared to be up and moving around, and you're asking that young child to go against their physiology and reorient themselves towards something that it's not built to do. Another aspect of this is a good understanding of a diagnosis of depression is, post-menopause post-menopause diagnoses. We saw in the earlier slide that a good chunk of the population of women in their 40s and 50s are on antidepressants, and so it's a question of what are we trying to control? Are we trying to control a process of hormones, or are we trying to change the process of neurotransmitters? And I think there's very little distinction between the two in understanding the role that different aspects of the body play in mood.
Yeah, and it's tough because the way in which we're becoming more inclusive of diagnosing things, I think it more and more gives people on the one hand, what it's doing is it's seeking to bring more structure to the human mind and to understanding. Uh, think of like a branch. You start off with just like this as mental illness, just this general concept, abstract concept of mental illness, and then you break that down into subcategories. Well, there's these different kinds. There's schizophrenia, there's bipolar, there's severe depression, there's anxiety. Well, then break those down into like, well, there's this kind of depression, there's this kind of anxiety, there's these different forms of schizophrenia, there's this types of bipolar. Then you break those down even more, and that's essentially what we're seeing with opening up the DSM-5. But a large part of what we're seeing is like these are diagnosing. They're diagnosing. Is like you said with ADHD, is a mismatch with the environment in which we've been inhabited. And what were you gonna say?
Well, another aspect that kind of coincides with this, one of the more controversial aspects when we migrated from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5 was the removal of the bereavement exclusion. So it used to be that if you were coming in, say you had a loss in the family, something really traumatic had happened, and you were obviously distraught from that, you were not able to be diagnosed with depression. So that bereavement exclusion has been removed from the DSM-5. And obviously I'm not really fit to give a full analysis of whether or not that's appropriate, but I think it's a good representation, and the controversy is a good example of the fact that this new manual is becoming more and more inclusive, and it's giving the opportunity for more and more people to be diagnosed with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, or mood disorders than ever before.
Right. Yeah. And so one like potential downside of this inclusivity is that more and more with a diagnosis, it feels as though people more and more have a reason to achieve health, or like to achieve homeostasis, even just like to become normal by external means, because they're diagnosed with some subset of a disease or like a disorder or an illness that they need to fix with a certain pill that's been designed to work on a certain pathway that is shown to be disrupted in this illness. And so it's like that is one aspect of it. That is one flaw I see in the growing inclusivity. But there's something else interesting about how we go about diagnosing these things in general. So if we take something like this crazy old man here, who we could say is a schizophrenic for now, just for the sake of the argument. Well, what is the criteria for diagnosing schizophrenia in the DSM-5? Well, here are the criteria that you use to diagnose schizophrenia. And you can see just by reading them, especially number 5, you can see like the subjectivity of the diagnosis. So negative symptoms. What entails negative symptoms? And it's really interesting because if you could say that a schizophrenic, a mild schizophrenic in some sense, would have been a shaman in past cultures. And shamans were the ones who transformed cultures, who brought revelation to cultures. So it's almost like I almost dare to say that, in some cases, should you even consider it in more mild forms, would you even consider it a mental illness? Now, in cases where you can't function by yourself and you can't maintain coherence in a job, for example, that might require intervention. But take someone like take Carl Jung with his Red Book. I know he didn't want the Red Book to be published and to be necessarily disseminated into the public, but it was nonetheless. And if you just hear the stories about him, he could have been classified as mildly schizophrenic,
or even major. I think a lot of people.
Yeah. And so and this gets into this cool quote with this really dope picture. I love this painting, and the quote reads, it's by Joseph Campbell. It says, "The psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with the light." So essentially, they both have characteristics of the same thing. They're both exposed to the same stimulus, kind of,
Yeah.
but one handles it more to a certain degree better than the other. But it's the same origin necessarily. So, in the case like Carl Jung, you would say that, or like in Jungian psychology, you would say that a shaman is someone who's more laid bare to the unconscious and to its contents, whereas a schizophrenic would be someone who's also made known of those unconscious entities, or like those things from the unconscious, but it's just to such a degree that it's overwhelming to the ego.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming to an ability to maintain stability.
Yeah, I think a more accessible example would be, main figures in the Bible who were, coming down from the mountains with revelations and new ideas for the way in which we can orient society in a more moral sense. So, if you characterize that person as delusional, even grandiose, and you discredit their new philosophy that came as this aha moment of insight and understanding of reality. And obviously, we're not saying that schizophrenics are well, shouldn't be diagnosed. But what we are saying is, in milder forms, these people are of use. And we've seen lots of people throughout history who were discredited by society as being, crazy for these very creative ideas, but who gave us incredibly useful tools to navigate our own life and went down in history as huge thinkers. But in their time, they were thought of as delusional, or they might have even been hallucinating in their moment of revelation.
Exactly. I think there was a quote. I don't know exactly. I want to say it was Albert Einstein, but it was something along the lines of, there's a quote that reads I don't remember, but it's something like, "In every genius, there's a touch of madness." I don't necessarily know the origins of that quote, but this is pretty much the idea of that. There's a link between great creativity or great intelligence, even, and uh, quote unquote, the pathology, mental illness. We've seen that correlation. And that would be something that I think would be really cool to get into in future discussions, talking about that link. But this is why schizophrenia isn't such a binary. Like, as time has developed, you can't just diagnose someone as schizophrenic or not. We've developed this more of a spectrum for schizophrenic. And so, going back to what we were just saying with the shaman versus a major schizophrenic, you could see the shaman would exist, or the more creative individual, the artist, even, the musician, whatever, the poet, they're more exposed to these symptoms, or these quote unquote delusions and hallucinations, this disorganized speech, catatonic behavior, more so than the layman, but not as much to the degree where it's debilitating their ability to function as their own person. And it makes for a new avenue of a new possibility of understanding how we're classifying mental illness. You can see at the bottom, creativity has some relation to certain mental disorders, like bipolar disorder, for example. I know has a lot of correlations with creative individuals, and schizophrenia is another one. There's a book called The Neuroscience of Creativity, released out of MIT, which is a great book on that. And there's a lot of discussion that's worth having from that book that I think we could get into.
Yeah, I mean,
and did you have any more thoughts on that?
Just one more thing I wanted to touch on is in terms of diagnosing these problems. Obviously, it's like we've spoken on. It's in its infancy stages, and we're attempting to bring a lot of order to the problem of how many different kinds of people exist. But what we haven't necessarily created is an idea of kind of what the archetypal person should be like. There's no sane human being to revert back to and understand this is what the optimal version of a human should be. And so like, yes, we should be more productive and we should be happier. We should be more coherent. And if we're not coherent, maybe something is wrong. But what we need to understand is humans come in so many different psychological kinds. There's so many categories to what it means to be a human being. So if we're not careful, we can pathologize a lot of people who can be of supreme use to us and who would be negatively impacted by thinking that there's something wrong with them. So that's what I'm looking forward to seeing, the way in which psychology moves towards, is having an understanding of how to have a comprehensive view of the different flavors of humanity.
Yeah, it's something that, to tie this back to what we talked about earlier, you have someone who's diagnosed with schizophrenia, who might be a more mild form of schizophrenia, and now that changes their perception of what they possess. Before, past cultures, their visions or their hallucinations could have been given to them, or could have been told by their fathers or their ancestors, that this is a gift. This is these are great insights into a realm beyond what most can comprehend. Whereas now, that's classified as a pathology, and now you think, oh, there's something wrong with me. I am out of context. I am mismatched with my society, and there's something wrong with me. There's something I need to fix, and now there's something to fix in their delusions, and it just adds on to the problem, or it adds on to the dilemma of how are we classifying, like, when is it the case that these visions or hallucinations become a problem,
Yeah. In there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score that Noah and I will be doing an in-depth analysis of later on. And in it, the author Bessel von der Kolk, hope I'm saying that right, he spoke on the way in which, obviously, medication has helped numerous people, but there's a way in which taking free will out of the individual's hands and putting it in the hands of insurance companies and then the pharmaceutical industry takes away the individual's free will. There's a lot to be said about the own person's ability to cope with their life. In psychology, there's a concept called learned helplessness. And what we can prove is that you can teach someone to give up. And to do that, they just eliminate all hopes for the future, and they don't attempt to heal in an appropriate way. And I think we run the risk of creating a society that learns to be helpless.
Exactly, or helpless, and only can be helped by external means, by something given to them, as opposed to what I think our society, our consciousness is moving towards, which is becoming more of our own personal agents, of our own agents of health, and those of camps of like Joe Dispenza, becoming the creators of the lives we want, and based upon our own thoughts, our own internal process, we manifest that physically as well as interpersonally, with the relationships that we want, with the financial situations that we desire, and that is sort of the duality between external and internal means of solving, of becoming healthier. And that actually gets us into this last slide, which is quite astounding. When I read this statistic, was from the World Health Organization, suicide being the second leading cause of death in 15 to 29-year-olds in 2016. I read that and I was kind of shook by that. And it lends itself, so like, what's our solution to this problem? Is it one or the other? Is it is it, like chemical or existential? And what I mean by that is, do we solve this by means of a mere chemical imbalance, uh, or is it a problem of mapping meaning onto our lives? I read in one of the articles that I included in the earlier slide, the one about HPA axis dysregulation. It talks about how there's a growing diagnosis of depression, or the majority of people who have depression experience it heavily in adolescence. And what I thought of that was, well, do they actually require medical intervention? And is this something worth diagnosing, or is it a fact that them being in adolescence and facing such a different world than what their mind is used to, they're having to try and find meaning. It's the first time they're having to map meaning into their lives and come to terms with the world, the larger world. And it's a growing of consciousness, and with that comes strife, and people can become depressed as a result of that burden of that great amount of stimulus coming on to them as they grow up.
Right. There's a huge influx of nihilism, I think, despite our comfort and despite the fact that we're inundated with entertainment, and, we have the opportunity to live better than the kings of our ancestors. There's still this sense of what is the purpose behind our strife, like you were saying. And it's definitely a huge question to tease out what percentage of the population has this orientation towards reality due to a health problem, and what part of it falls on the society to create opportunities for a truly meaningful life, to create things to fight for, and to create opportunities for growth in the individual, and to foster community. All these things are things that we're failing at currently, and there's a huge need for the coming generations to shift away from the idea of, comfort and the abuse of drugs, and just kind of this orientation towards life that says, nothing really matters because I'm going to die anyway. So, because that leads to the question of why not now? And it's obviously a heavy-hitting problem, and it's a problem that philosophers have been attempting to remedy for a long time now. But I think it falls on the individual to create an opportunity for life to be the best that it can be, and to create a community in which the individual can feel at home despite the complexity and despite the suffering that they will have to face throughout their life.
And I think in a nutshell, that's the best way in which we can word the solution we're offering, so to speak, or the way that we think the solution is, or what we think the solution is, which is becoming more conscious agents, becoming becoming more conscious. And because of that, we take health into our own hands. We become more, for lack of a better term, enlightened individuals, become more aware of our own processes, and understand that everything created in the external world is just a reflection of what first came from our internal vision of those things. Everything arises out of a psychic state, or of a psychic origin. Like, you can't interpret the world, unless it comes through your psyche. Like, it's a priori in your interpretation of everything. So everything begins from the inside out, and that's kind of, I guess, the solution you can offer. Not that there isn't external things. Like, another way you could parallel what the solution we're offering of being extrinsic versus intrinsic. Do you solve this by things outside of you, like pills and whatnot, or is it by something internally, by a shift in consciousness, a shift in perception? Well, again, it's probably not one or the other. This goes back to like the purple pill. It's not one or the other necessarily. Like, in terms of extrinsic things, you rely on oxygen to breathe, to live, to continue your function. And then, immediately after that, you require water, and then food. And outside of that specifically, of biological things specifically, you require relationships to others, and you require healthy interpersonal relationships to maintain health. And that's a part of our biology that's been, or part of our organism that's been shaped by things external of us. Like I said before, we've been shaped to survive in our environment. That's what evolution is. And so we survive based upon how we've been shaped by our environment. Did I word that right? Or we've been shaped to survive our environment, and so we've been shaped by that external world. And that's why that's where the argument for external things comes in. And you take the other half of that, you have the Stoics that argued that, you have stimuli that constantly comes to you from the external world, but your reaction to that stimuli is what governs, or is what is the ultimate governing factor in how you perceive your life to be. If it's healthy or not, if it's well or not, if it's a good life or not. And it begins with that internal state. Carl Jung would say the same thing. Ultimately, as a psychologist, he wants his clients, people, to become more conscious of their unconscious, because that increase in consciousness has the potential to become more aware, and with that increase in awareness, to learn of oneself, and to heal, and to understand what it is that is worth keeping and what is worth shedding off. And that, again, Joe Dispenza is another one of these guys. And they all argue from the inside out that we heal, as opposed to the outside in.
Right. And I would argue that it's not necessarily extrinsic versus intrinsic. It's learning how to cultivate both. They're both incredibly important, obviously. And
Yeah, and exactly. And that's, yeah, versus isn't necessarily the right term, but just to just kind of just set up the dichotomy, and to show that, essentially, like, you could take the left side, or you could take one side or the other, being the red pill and the blue pill. And again, we advocate for that purple pill.
perfect. All right. Well, until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in.